Hey everybody, ANCHOPETE here, and it is time for us once again to talk about something that you might have heard about, but not enough people are discussing. I'm talking about the prequel to Dune book known as Dune, the Lady of Caladan. One of the most popular videos I made was a review of the first book in the series called Dune, the Duke of Caladan. It takes me a long time to finish books, and I just finished this sequel book. You want to find out what I thought about it? Check out this review right here. In September of 2021, just before the release of Denis Villeneuve's live-action Dune adaptation, Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson put out their 15th novel in the Dune franchise, Dune, Lady of Caladan. I read Frank Herbert's Dune when I was in high school, and I've been a fan of them ever since Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson started putting them out in 1999. That is over 20 years ago at this point, and more than half of my life I have been a fan. Don't get me wrong, I know they are taking as many eggs as they can get from the golden spice goose as possible, to the point where the goose's skin has cracked and dried and its bones have become brittle. With this newest trilogy of Dune books, I'm amazed at how many new characters and story beats Herbert and Anderson can cram into the time period 1 year before the original Dune book. This happens with the ongoing story told in comic books as well. Essentially, these new Dune books are retcon and an expansion of the continuity, causing periods of time that seemed uneventful when compared with the original story to become super eventful. When you read the original Dune by Frank Herbert, you can make the assumption that there's been a feud between House Atreides and House Harkonnen, and that there have been multiple assassination attempts and various struggles between the two noble houses. You would also assume that there had been unrest among the noble houses in general that the forces of Emperor Shaddam IV had to quelch. But these two books reveal a story dramatically more epic than that. With this new trilogy, beginning with Dune, the Duke of Caladan, it is revealed that just prior to the events of the first Dune book, there was an outright rebellion against the Emperor. A group calling itself the Noble Commonwealth is trying to take Shaddam down, and entire houses are getting obliterated during the Noble Commonwealth's conflict with the Empire. In the sequel book, Dune, the Lady of Caladan, whether gunning for Duke Leto Atreides, Lady Jessica, or Paul, the enemies of House Atreides are out for blood. Throughout the two books in this series so far, Paul and his parents are put in mortal danger multiple times. Speaking of Paul's parents, when you read the original Dune book, it is very clear that Lady Jessica and the Duke love each other deeply. The Duke is aware of Jessica's loyalty to the Bene Gesserit, but he trusts her completely, and is eternally grateful that she bore him a son. In the Caladan trilogy, we learn that there was a giant rift between the Duke and Lady Jessica, when she chose to act upon the wishes of the Bene Gesserit and kept her actions secret to him. This is the reason why I bring up the comparison to comic book retcons. Does it get to a point where the events in these prequel stories are more epic and eventful than the events in the original story that inspired them? I asked myself that question the entire time I read Lady of Caladan. But that didn't keep me from thoroughly enjoying the book. Let's talk about what I did enjoy. I had read that Frank Herbert believed that humanity would always incorporate a hierarchy system because humans naturally wanted to be ruled over. Even though Dune is set 10,000 years in the future, the characters live within a feudal society. The majority of the female Dune characters are in submissive roles, which matches up with the roles you would expect them to have in a feudal society. The original Dune book seemed progressive at the time, since many of the female characters were Bene Gesserit witches, which is the closest thing that Dune has to Jedi. One thing I have noticed, though, after reading close to a dozen Dune books, is that the female main characters only fit into two categories. They are Bene Gesserit witches manipulating the nobility, or they are hardened Fremen warriors. In this Caladan trilogy, two of the new female characters exist outside of these two categories. One of the new characters introduced in the Duke of Caladan, Melina Aru, is one of the most powerful women in the Imperium, and her son is the leader of the Noble Commonwealth. I appreciate the fact that Melina and her agent, who also happens to be the Emperor Shaddam's wife, are not Bene Gesserits. We also see Jessica in a different light than before. In the original series and in the spin-offs by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, Jessica is always supporting Leto or Paul. The bulk of her scenes feature also the Duke or his son. In the Duke of Caladan, Jessica was forced to return to the Bene Gesserit homeworld of Wallach 9. Without spoiling too much of the Lady of Caladan, I'll point out that Jessica spends the majority of the book away from Paul and Leto and from Caladan. We get to see what an independent Jessica looks like. Even though she is still very much focused on getting back to Leto and Paul, we see her have to focus on her own survival and consider what her role would look like without being the Duke's concubine. There are always comparisons between Dune and Star Wars, since the original Star Wars borrowed so heavily from Dune. Also, there are images and concepts from Jodorowsky's Dune that are used throughout the Star Wars movies. Lady of Caladan reminded me a lot of The Empire Strikes Back, splitting up the main characters for the majority of the story and ending on a cliffhanger with multiple plot threads still left open. On both a macro and micro scale, these Dune prequel trilogies follow a similar pattern. We reintroduce the main characters that made everyone fall in love with Dune in the first place. Interwoven with these scenes are scenes that introduce a handful of new ancillary characters. These ancillary characters bring a level of tension to the story. Unlike Paul, the Duke, Baron Harkonnen, Gurney Halleck, and the others, we don't know the ultimate fate of these new supporting characters. After the introduction scenes, which can take up the first 100 pages of the book or so, then there comes the plotting and the scheming between the major characters. This takes up another 100 or so pages. Finally, things truly begin to escalate. Characters die, usually innocents that take the blame for the schemes of the cold-blooded nobles. Leto suffers on some level, and Paul learns a lesson that brings him yet another step closer to becoming Muad'Dib. The Baron concocts a fiendish plot which has the potential to vastly expand his wealth and possibly wipe out a few Atreides. But by the end of the book, the Baron's plan backfires, and he is just barely able to save his royal family from utter destruction. The Baron usually suffers a major humiliation while he saves his floating, blubbery backside. It sounds like these Dune spin-offs are so repetitive that I can predict what is going to happen in each one. Well, to bring back the comparison to superhero comics, I can easily predict what is going to happen in a Batman story arc, but I still look forward to every issue because I love the characters so dearly. I think that's why there is still a hunger for these Dune books. The fans, like myself, love these characters so much, and getting another chance to read about Gurney Halleck strumming away on his balisette, or the Beast Raban trying to win the affections of his evil uncle, or the Lady of Caladan defying her sisterhood, is always worth the price of a new Dune book.